Good evening, this is your host, Mr. Dark, bringing you a series of some of the most terrifying, strange, and true short horror stories of crimes, murders, abductions, and experiences. You're listening to the Dark Side Diaries podcast. Acid bath murderer John George Haigh. John Haigh was born on July 24, 1909, in Lincolnshire, England. He was brought up in Outwood, Yorkshire, where he was raised by his ultra-religious parents. Haigh later in his life would say that in his childhood he had suffered from recurring religious nightmares. Despite this, he grew fond of classical music and learned to play the piano throughout his childhood, something he would use later on in life. At 17 years old, he left school and became an apprentice at a firm of motor engineers. But he would only last a year at that job and moved on to other jobs like sales and advertising. Haigh didn't like working for someone else, so he decided to go into business for himself. But the business was forging vehicle documents. In 1934, Haigh would marry 23-year-old Betty Hammer. The same year, the relationship would end pretty quickly and Haigh would be sent to jail for fraud. He would receive a 15-month sentence. While Haigh was serving his prison time, Betty would divorce him and give birth to a baby girl. She gave the baby up for adoption and officially left Haigh. His conservative family ostracized him from then onwards. Starting in 1936 through 1943, Haigh would be in and out of prison for fraud, theft, and stealing, which is where he would learn sinister behavior. While in prison, Haigh realized that his repeated prison time stemmed from leaving his victims alive to report the crime. He became intrigued by the crimes of French murderer Georges Alexandre Serret, who in 1925 had disposed of his victims' bodies using sulfuric acid. While in prison, he learned a method of destroying the body of a murder victim by dissolving it in the acid. He experimented and tested this with field mice, and he found that it took only 30 minutes for the body to dissolve. After being released from prison in 1943, Haigh would run into a former employee of his when he first moved to London, named William McSwan. McSwan would introduce Haigh to his parents, Donald and Amy. McSwan worked for his parents collecting rents on their London properties, and Haigh became extremely envious of his lifestyle. In early September 1944, Haigh and McSwan would meet for a drink at the Goat in Kensington, and after they would leave and go to Hay's workshop, McSwan would disappear that night. Haigh lured him into the basement of his workshop and bashed him over the head. He then put McSwan's body into a 40-gallon drum and poured concentrated sulfuric acid into it. 2 days later, he returned to find that the body had become sludge when he poured it down a sewer. Knowing McSwan's parents would be looking for him, he told them that their son had gone into hiding to avoid being called up for military service. He was able to maintain this deception by sending their parents letters pretending to be from their son. During this time, Haigh took over McSwan's house and began collecting the rents for his parents. But what he really wanted was the money from the properties. In 1945, McSwan's parents became curious as to why their son had not returned yet, as the war was coming to an end. On July 2, 1945, knowing he would eventually have to fix the situation with McSwan's parents, he lured them into the same basement he killed their son by telling them William was back from Scotland for a surprise visit, and in cold blood Haigh murdered them, with blows to the head and disposing of the bodies in acid like he did to William. With the McSwan family gone, he then stole the identity of William McSwan. He was able to obtain complete control over all the possessions and sold all of them, stealing about 8,000 pounds, which in 1945 was a lot of money. Haigh then moved into the Onslow Court Hotel in Kensington, where he would stay for a while. By 1947, Haigh was a gambler and was running low on money. That same year, he met a couple named Archibald and Rose Henderson, who were selling a property Haigh took an interest in. Being fond of Haigh, the couple invited him back to their flat to play the piano for their housewarming party. While at the flat, Haigh stole a revolver from Archibald, where he was planning to use it in the next crime. Haigh was renting a small workshop in Crawley, Sussex, where he moved his drums with acid. He lured Archibald into the workshop, telling him he had an invention to show him. He would shoot him and put his body in the acid. He then lured Rose to the workshop by telling her that her husband was ill. He would shoot her in the head and put her body in the acid as well. After disposing of the Hendersons' bodies, he forged a letter from them and sold all of their possessions for £8,000. In 1949, Haigh was still living in the same hotel for the last 4 years. He would often during mealtime run into Miss Olive Duran Dinkin, a 69-year-old widow who had also lived at the hotel for over 6 years. By this time, Haigh was calling himself an engineer, and during their discussions, Olive would tell him about an idea she had. Haigh invited her to his workshop, where he would shoot her in the head with the stolen revolver, steal all of her valuables, and put her in the acid bath. 2 days later, a friend of Olive's reported her missing. Detectives found Haigh suspicious right away and soon discovered his record of theft and fraud, which made them search the workshop. Police found a dry cleaner's receipt for a coat Miss Duran Dinkins wore, and also papers referring to the Hendersons and McSwans. The workshop didn't have a drain, so Haigh disposed of the remains by pouring out the container on a rubble pile at the back of the property. Investigation of the area by a pathologist found 28 pounds of human body fat, part of a human foot, human gallstones, and part of a denture, which was later identified by Olive's dentist during the trial. Haigh would be convicted of the murders of 6 people, although he claimed to have killed a total of 9. He did not use acid to actually kill his victims, he said, but rather as a foolproof method of disposing the bodies. While on trial, Haigh pleaded insanity and insisted to the court that he drank the blood of his victims. He was found guilty in 1949 and sentenced to death by hanging. A few months later, Haigh was led to the gallows and hanged by an executioner. The boogeyman Albert Fish. Albert Fish was born in Washington, D.C. on May 19, 1870. His mother was 32 years old, and his father was 75 years old when he was born. When Fish's father died in 1875, his mother was unable to care for him or his siblings, which had her put them in an orphanage. Fish would say caretakers in the orphanage often beat the children there, and they would even encourage the children to hurt each other as well. Unlike most children, Fish grew to enjoy these beatings. In 1880, when his mother found steady work, she eventually took him back. Being out of the orphanage, he continued with the disturbing behavior of administering self-afflicted beatings in his spare time, soon developing a psychosexual fixation on the correlation between pleasure and pain. Fish's family had a history of mental illness. His uncle suffered from mania. One of his brothers was confined in a state mental hospital, and his sister Annie was diagnosed with a mental affliction. 3 other relatives were diagnosed with mental illness, and his mother had visual hallucinations. In 1882, at the age of 12, he began a homosexual relationship with a telegraph boy. The boy would introduce Fish to unsanitary practices such as drinking urine and eating feces. Fish also began visiting public baths where he could watch other boys undress and spent a great amount of time on his weekends at these places. In 1890, Fish moved to New York City, where he became a prostitute and began raping young boys. 8 years would pass, and in 1898 his mother arranged a marriage for him with Anna Mary Hoffman, who was 9 years younger than him. Altogether, they had 6 children in the relationship. Throughout 1898, Fish would work as a house painter. He was still molesting children, mostly boys younger than the age of 6. Fish would state at one time, when a male lover took him to a waxwork museum and he saw a bisection of the male anatomy, he became obsessed with mutilation. In 1910, Fish was working in Wilmington, Delaware. He met 19-year-old Thomas Kedden, where Fish brought him back to where he was staying. The two of them began a sadomasochistic relationship. Fish wasn't clear whether or not he forced Kedden to do these things, but in his confession he implies that the man was intellectually disabled. 10 days into their relationship, Fish locked Kedden into an abandoned farmhouse. For over 2 weeks, Fish tortured him. Fish eventually tied Kedden up and cut off half of his penis. "I shall never forget his scream or the look he gave me," Fish later recalled. Fish was originally going to kill Kedden, cut up his body and take it home, but the weather was hot and he feared he would draw attention to himself. Fish decided he had enough for the day, so he poured peroxide over the wound and wrapped Kedden's penis in a Vaseline-lined handkerchief. Fish left a $10 bill, kissed Kedden goodbye, and walked out. Fish said, "Took first train I could get back home. Never heard what become of him or tried to find out." In 1917, Fish would find himself the single parent of his 6 kids, as his wife would leave him for a roommate of theirs once Fish became unable to conceal his mental illness of hallucinations. At the same time, he began to indulge in self-harm by embedding needles into his groin and abdomen. Fish's children noticed his odd ways, but fortunately they claimed the worst he ever did to them was teach them mildly sadomasochistic games. Other children weren't as lucky, as Fish started to escalate with his evil ways. Fish started to become preoccupied with the idea of cannibalism, and like many cannibals, he began by eating raw meat. Fish would now start to target the mentally handicapped or African Americans as his victims. He started in 1919 when he stabbed an intellectually disabled child in Georgetown, Washington, D.C. Fish would later claim that he would occasionally pay boys to find other children for him. Fish tortured, mutilated, and murdered young children with what he calls his implements of hell: a meat cleaver, a butcher knife, and a small handsaw. In 1928, Fish saw an advertisement in a newspaper from an 18-year-old named Edward Budd who was looking for farm work. Fish stopped at the Budd family home and had planned to mutilate and kill Edward after luring him to do non-existent farm work. But Fish would change his mind and plan when he spotted Edward's 10-year-old sister, Grace Budd. It turned out Grace would be much more suited for Fish's desires. Fish was able to convince Grace's parents to let her attend his fake niece's birthday party. This would be the last time they would see Grace alive. Police investigated her disappearance for 6 years. Coming up short, they finally got the lead they needed when Fish sent a letter to Grace's parents, that 6th year after her disappearance. Fish would write, "I took her to an empty house in Westchester I had already picked out. When we got there, I told her to remain outside. She picked wildflowers. I went upstairs and stripped all my clothes off. I know if I did not, I would get her blood on them. When all was ready, I went to the window and called her. Then I hid in a closet until she was in the room. When she saw me all naked, she began to cry and tried to run downstairs. I grabbed her, and she said she would tell her mama. First, I stripped her naked. Now she did kick, bite, and scratch. I choked her to death, then cut her in small pieces so I could take my meat to my rooms, cook, and eat it. How sweet and tender her little ass was, roasted in the oven. It took me 9 days to eat her entire body. I did not fuck her, though I could have had, I wished. She died a virgin." Fish wanted to get a thrill out of causing panic, as he had gotten away with killing, raping, and eating so many children already. But police were able to track him down by the paper he wrote the letter on. It was unique to the place Fish was staying at. When police apprehended Fish, he confessed without any pressure and gave graphic details of his many murders. Out of the dozens of murders he confessed to, the police could only verify 3 with evidence. Among all of Fish's brutal confessions, there was one that was far more disturbing. It was the kidnapping and killing of 4-year-old Billy Gaffney. Billy was playing with his 3-year-old friend Billy Beaton from the next door apartment. Beaton would tell police the boogeyman took him. Fish recounted Billy's mutilation in horrifying detail. "I whipped his bare behind till the blood ran from his legs. I cut off his ears, nose, slit his mouth from ear to ear, gouged out his eyes. He was dead then. I stuck the knife in his belly and held my mouth to his body and drank his blood." Billy Gaffney's body would never be found. Fish was found guilty and sentenced to death. On January 16, 1936, Fish was executed by electric chair. Fish was allowed to chronicle the details of his many abductions and murders before he died. Fish's lawyer stated that the notes were so vile he refused to have them released. This concludes our episode of the Dark Side Diaries. Please remember to follow, like, share, and subscribe for future episodes.